Esther Rantzen, diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, has been a leading voice in the debate about assisted dying. She's made it clear, Kamal, she wants to travel to Dignitas in Switzerland and take her own life when things become too difficult.
At the moment, that would be illegal in England and Wales. It's also being debated in Scotland. The question of assisted dying affects everybody, and today a new attempt to make assisted dying legal has been launched in the House of Lords.
It's a sensitive and difficult issue that we are going to try and navigate in today's Daily Tea special. With me, Camilla Tominey.
And me, Kamal Ahmed. We know, Camilla, that this is not a new debate. It's been going on for decades, but it's actually been a political debate as well for over 10 years.
And that was inspired, actually, Kamal, by what was going on in America at the time. So in Oregon, the state of Oregon, they produced a Death with Dignity Act, which basically allowed assisted dying in that state, and that has been the case since 1997. It is interesting, Kamal, isn't it, that the people you talk to who have a stake in the game when it comes to assisted dying have usually watched a loved one in a great degree of pain and suffering. This is one of those stories where politics and the personal definitely collide.
And where it can be quite clear how you feel as an individual emotionally, but actually passing legislation to effect the change that could make assisted dying legal is incredibly complicated. So the attempt in 2013 did get to what's called the second reading. It then collapsed because of the 2015 election. It's been discussed since then, but this is the first time that we've got back to a live debate back in the Houses of Parliament about assisted dying.
Well, someone who very much hopes that Lord Falconer is successful with this legislation is, of course, Esther Rantzen. Now, she has said that Keir Starmer has promised her that there would be a debate if Labour won the election. We're now at that stage. I spoke to Esther last month. Well, Esther, first of all, how are you doing? I know it's your 84th birthday on June the 22nd. You've given an interview saying you're looking forward to that. You planted tulips last year that you didn't think you'd necessarily see in bloom.
All true, all true. And I'm on this one of these fascinating new drugs. I call it my miracle drug. And so far, it seems to be holding it at bay. No, I said to my consultant, when am I going to die? And he said sometime in the next 10 years. So
wow.
Maybe I'll make, my mother made 94, so maybe I will. Who knows?
When you ask the consultant that, how do you feel about that question yourself? I mean, presumably you do, and you have been thinking because of the assisted dying debate, your own death. Has that been difficult to think about?
Well, when you're diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, whether or not there's a public debate about assisted dying, you automatically think about the fact that you are mortal. It wasn't news to me because I knew I was going to drop off my perch sometime fairly soon. I mean, when you're in your 80s, we all know that.
Yes.
The debate about assisted dying has really amazed me because I mentioned that I joined Dignitas and I had no idea it was going to resonate with so many people. But in the recent parliamentary debate in the Westminster Hall, one of the speakers talked about the fact that since Harold Shipman's murders,
yes,
the regulations involving doctors have tightened up.
Yes.
So that it's much harder for them quietly to bump you off in the way, they did in the older days. So I think more people have seen people they love die in pain in a way that they would really not wish to, and asking for help to die and not being given it. And I think that has persuaded a lot of people that the law is a mess at the moment and needs clearing up.
I saw that YouGov polling suggests that 73% of the British public, so 3/4 nearly, think that doctors should assist in cases of terminal illness, Esther. I mean, is that the distinction to be drawn here, that the case must be terminal, that somebody must have been told, look, you've only got months to live, in order for this even to be a consideration?
Well, that's the proposal at the moment. And some people are putting a timescale on it, like 6 months to live. We're in a quite good position here because other countries all over the place, Netherlands, Australia, all over the place, many of the American states, etc., have legalized it in different ways. So we can look at the evidence from those countries and see what works. Canada, and the one thing I can tell you about those countries is not one of them would go back to criminalizing assisted dying.
Yes.
They all vary in the kinds of regulations they put in, the precautions they put in. And obviously there must be very careful precautions to protect vulnerable people from, being pressured into taking their lives or other circumstances which are quite wrong and should not be allowed. But if someone asks for help to die, it's a sort of choice that we're giving people these days over marriage, over birth, all kinds of things. So it's the final choice, I think.
But then there are concerns about mission creep. Did you watch Liz Carr's documentary on BBC One, Better Off Dead? Liz Carr is the actress from, well, she's best known for Silent Witness, but she's also a disability campaigner. She makes the point that she was in a wheelchair from 14, and she looks back in that documentary at a letter she wrote to her mother saying she wished she could die at the time that she was diagnosed. But as she points out, she's gone on to live a very happy life.
Yes, and I know that a lot of disabled people are very concerned that they'll be pressured. And I think what that reflects is society's attitude to disability, because they clearly feel vulnerable and that people are telling them that they would be better off dead and so on. But suppose you're a disabled person who is terminally ill, in great pain. Shouldn't you be allowed to ask for help to die? Shouldn't we all be asked? If given the choice, I can understand how they feel, and I think there were probably exactly the same doubts about when the law relating to terminating pregnancy were relaxed and people were given more choice.
Yes.
But the fact is that nobody is suggesting anything other than someone requesting for help being given the choice. Nobody is suggesting that the choice be imposed on anyone. No. That's all we're asking for.
Although there was another example in the Liz Carr documentary of a woman in Canada. She had been involved in a car accident. She became extremely depressed because of her circumstances, even though she had the hope of a recovery. And she decided that she would take her own life and didn't tell her family about it. And of course, it's left her daughter distraught because she felt that her mother would have had a chance at a life of quality had she been given more medical and indeed psychological help. There's that concern, Esther, isn't there, that due to a lack of services, this may be an option if there is this mission creep that people take if they've got mental health problems, perhaps if they haven't got enough money, perhaps if they feel lonely.
Yeah, well, we could go on perhapsing for a long time here. The fact is that in this country, we're not considering mental health pain as one of the conditions where someone can ask for help to die. I know that mental health can create just as much suffering as physical health if you're ill. So, but we're not considering that. And indeed, Canada has delayed bringing in the provision that would enable those with mental health suffering to ask for assisted death. You can only do it with physical suffering, and that's a choice for the parliamentarians to make. But I think the other argument that's sometimes put forward is that treating mental health issues is improving, and that one day soon there will be effective treatment for depression, which sometimes at the moment is a terminal illness because it does cause people to take their own lives, sometimes under very difficult circumstances, like this lady in Canada.
Yes.
How much better, surely, to have an assisted death with all your family around you, everybody agreeing that it's the right thing for you.
What does a good death look like to you, Esther? Because you say you've registered with Dignitas, and you've also said, look, I don't want my family to remember me rolling around in agony, which I think most people can sympathise with that sentiment. But if you did go out to Switzerland, you'd have to be by yourself, wouldn't you? Because otherwise your children could be classed as complicit in your assisted suicide. Still a crime in this country. So you could be facing the prospect of dying alone.
Yep.
And how do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's not ideal. It's the strongest argument, I think, for saying, come on, Britain, change your law. England and Wales. Scotland is not for the first time ahead of us in this. Yes. Jersey doing well, Isle of Man doing well.
I mean, under what circumstances could you see yourself taking up that place at Dignitas?
Oh, well, I mean, if a scan showed that, the miracle drug was no longer a miracle, at the moment, one of the conditions is for legalizing it is 6 months. So I'd have to say to my oncologist, that 10-year thing you said, could you tell me now where we are on this road? Look, we're all dying, Camilla, aren't we? We're all dying.
Yes.
When I say to any of my medical friends and relatives, am I dying? They always say we all are. So it's only a question of trying to have a good death, however you define it.
Well, I discussed there with Esther Rantzen this idea of mission creep, and the Netherlands provides quite a good case study for what does happen when assisted dying laws are introduced. So in the Netherlands, that legislation was introduced in 2001, and assisted dying was legalised for anyone, quotes, experiencing unbearable suffering with no prospect of improvement. So that's a much wider definition, Kamal, than just saying that it should be for people with a terminal illness with 6 months or less left to live. It can be both self-administered and physician-assisted. Children between 12 and 18 can be allowed.
Seems remarkable, that, doesn't it? When you look at those figures and you see the number of people who had assisted deaths, just under 10,000 in 2023, and that idea that children at that age could be allowed to have an assisted death in certain circumstances. And that figure 10,000, sometimes those numbers seem a little, what do I compare them with? And actually, it is 5.4% of all deaths in the Netherlands. So it clearly becomes quite a significant part of the discussions around all the deaths you have in a nation if you start having assisted dying.
And that figure's gone up. So it was 4.5% in 2021, 5.1% in 2022. It's on an upwards trajectory. The most interesting aspect of this, though, and again, this is something that I discussed with Esther, under what circumstances are people using this legislation? And in 2023, 138 assisted deaths in the Netherlands were due to mental illness. Again, there's an upward trajectory because that number was 115 the year before. So although the most common reason in the Netherlands for requesting an assisted death is due to cancer, over 50%, 57%, actually it's 58%, there is this mission creep of people wanting to have an assisted death because of mental health problems.
We shouldn't forget, of course, these are only a few years of statistics. So what may be happening is you get this initial rise and then you reach a steady state.
Yes.
So it's whether or not it's the mission creep that's leading to an increase which continues, or it's a country feeling its way to a steady state situation. So just worth remembering that when you look at quite a short run in years on statistics.
Well, let's try and find out what the thinking is in the Netherlands. Abigail Buchanan, our features writer, joins us in the Daily Tea studio. Abigail, you've been in the Netherlands. You've spoken to a number of people out there who have been affected by this legislation. Give us some examples of some of the people you spoke to.
What struck me first is that while the numbers for mental health are much smaller than the overall euthanasia numbers, they are on the increase. And while a lot of the psychiatric profession are still really uneasy about this as an issue, there is kind of a sea change happening where it's more accepted. One of the doctors I spoke to, Menno Osterhoff, he's become a campaigner on the issue. He didn't have kind of any interest in euthanasia professionally until 2016. But he's since started providing second opinions and then performing the procedure himself on people as young as 16, which to our sensibilities is really shocking. But of course, it's actually perfectly legal.
What did he say about performing the procedure, ending the life of teenagers?
He said that he has sleepless nights over it, but believes that it's a choice between two evils, the choice between kind of forcing someone to suffer unbearably and between ending their life. And I think everybody can relate to the idea that if someone is in unbearable suffering, you'd want to do something about it. But of course, the idea that you would effectively take the life of someone who would otherwise have a really long life expectancy, there's no physical illness there.
So the teenager cases were ones of mental health, were they, rather than incurable illness? No.
So Menno's specialism, he's a psychiatrist, a child and adolescent psychiatrist. So these are all mental health cases.
Can we just step back a little bit? In the Netherlands, what is the debate like? Because here, of course, we're in the foothills of this discussion. You know, Camilla, your interview with Esther Rantzen is a plea for an honest debate and that it's a respectful debate because, of course, there are many, many nuanced positions. I just wondered what sense you got in the Netherlands. Is there a broader debate about the rights and wrongs of this? Because what a lot of people say is that once you've done it, you would never go back. You would never reverse the idea that people should be allowed to have what Esther describes as a good death, which is under their control. Is that debate in the Netherlands still going, or is this sort of a settled matter?
It is very much still going. Polling suggests that mostly people in the Netherlands are in support of it when it relates to physical illness. And obviously it's been legal now for a number of years. And so in that sense, it's fairly normalised and well adjusted. There are a lot of people who would still at least debate whether this is the right thing to do in regards to psychiatric conditions. But again, what I was struck by is we're at a watershed moment here in the UK as we kind of enter this debate. And they've had several of those moments, obviously when it was legalised to begin with. And then in 2018, the first kind of high-profile case of a woman aged 29 who received euthanasia for a mental health condition. That generated headlines all around the world and was another kind of spark point of debate. You know, what should we be doing with this? Is this right? But as the years have gone on, even though the change has been incremental, it's sort of, I suppose, becoming more normalised.
What discussions are regulated discussions? I'm interested in, once the law is passed, how do you keep a live debate around the morals of the situation, the medical issues around this issue? Because, of course, it's always changing. People's judgments of incapacity are changing. People's ability to be treated at end of life are changing. Palliative care is changing. I just wondered, are there any lessons from the Netherlands that we could learn from here in the UK which could help us have the types of conversations that Esther Rantzen has asked for?
Very interesting question. I think one thing to note here is that the law in the Netherlands started very open. It started with this concept of unbearable suffering rather than a specific diagnosis or a specific life expectancy. So in that way, it's not an open goal, but it's allowed for that to shift over time based on what people's perception ultimately of unbearable suffering is. I think in terms of what lessons we can learn from here, there's been absolutely no suggestion that this would ever be kind of tabled as an option for this country. But I think it just reinforces the fact that whatever kind of legislative change there is here, it needs to be very carefully considered within very kind of strict parameters.
You had a very powerful and moving conversation with a 40-year-old mother of two. Tell us about that.
That was honestly one of the hardest interviews I've done in my career. It was a woman who's 40. She has two young children, aged 10 and 5. She's asked not to be named because her children don't yet know that she's planning to end her life. She's had severe depression for the past 10 years, and that's just worsened over time instead of improved with treatment. And she's currently an inpatient at a psychiatric hospital in the eastern Netherlands, and she's waiting for the final green light for her euthanasia.
And when you said to her, how does she feel about leaving her children behind, what did she say?
She said, it's not so much that I want to die, it's that I can't live like this. And when I asked her about the conversation she'd had with her husband, she's happily married, and with her parents, she said her husband had said that while he understands her suffering as a human being, as a father, he obviously can't grasp it because, he'll be taking care of their children alone. So it's unimaginable suffering, but I saw her suffering as much as I appreciated, the suffering of her family as well. It seemed like she was in an impossible position.
We, Camilla, discussed, didn't we, the death of your mother, the death of my father, and how hard we would have found it to be in that type of situation, understanding if either of our parents had asked to end their own lives under their own control. Is the decision-making in the Netherlands wholly left to the individual? Because obviously mental incapacity is something that can't be judged by somebody who is in a particular stage of mental distress. How are those judgments judged, so to speak, with doctors, other regulated bodies?
Obviously, this is the central, thorniest question, because who decides whether the desire to die is a symptom of a mental illness or a logical the result of it? And the answer is that lies in the hands of actually a very small number of doctors. To request euthanasia, you would typically go to your sort of primary physician, that could be your GP or in this case your psychiatrist. If they say no, which they often do, you can apply to a specialist euthanasia centre. It's called the Euthanasia Expertise Centre in The Hague. And they offer the chance for people who've had it rejected by their GP to apply again, essentially. And then you need sign-off from a specialist euthanasia doctor, and in psychiatric cases, an independent second opinion from another psychiatrist. But obviously that leaves, it leaves a lot of grey areas. As I saw, the psychiatrist that I interviewed offers second opinions for a number of patients, and he is personally in favour of euthanasia for this reason. So obviously the argument would then, I suppose, follow that he's more likely to sign it off.
Did you go into it having an opinion, and did your opinion change as you interviewed the people you did?
I think I am grateful to not be in that situation, and I was really confronted by the suffering of these people, the patients themselves and their relatives. I tried to go into it with an open mind, but I was confronted by the pain that I saw, the pain of the patients who've chosen this path and the pain of their families, and just came away very conflicted about what actually is the right thing to do in this situation. I don't necessarily think it's this, but I can see how when faced with really unbearable suffering, you might feel like there's no other option.
Do the families have any role at all? I mean, Camilla, these things, you do immediately go to your own loved ones and dearest. I mean, if my loved ones were in a state of mental or physical distress and they had decided something, I would almost feel that I also had some rights here to be at least involved in
like the
conversation.
Of the mother.
Yes.
From the age of 16, so even between 16 and 18, you don't need explicit parental permission to seek euthanasia. Your family have to be involved in the decision making until you're 18, but after that it's entirely down to you. So there's no legal obligation to involve families.
Wow.
But obviously this 40-year-old mother who I spoke to, you can just, it's unimaginable that as her husband or her child, her mother-in-law, her father-in-law, her parents, you wouldn't want to have a say in the path that she's choosing.
And how about the parents of teenagers who now have this agency in ending their own life? Imagine being a parent confronted with a child.
I find it
it's
impossible to even think about.
It's unimaginable. What was the response? I think you spoke to one mother whose daughter was euthanized at the age of 17.
Yeah, that again was really shocking for me. I think it's important to note that the parents here aren't doing it on purpose. Their children don't actually need their explicit permission, but at the same time, you just can't get your head around it. The mother who I spoke to spoke of obviously the deep sadness she felt at the loss of her daughter, but she also got to the point where she felt like after so many years of her being really ill, it was almost a relief that she didn't have to suffer that way anymore.
Did the mother try and oppose it initially and then?
In this case, it's going to sound shocking, but it doesn't sound like she particularly did. I think we've got to remember that it's a bit more normalised over there than it is here.
Yes.
But I interviewed another family before, actually, for a separate piece that ran in the Telegraph magazine. And her daughter had died by euthanasia, aged 33, after having anorexia for a number of years. And she spoke a bit more about the internal conflict that presents. For her and her husband, she said it put a strain on their marriage. They had different views on it. But ultimately, faced with the fact that she was pursuing this anyway, they chose to kind of accept it and try and love her through it rather than fight until the end.
And we need to be respectful, don't we, of people's journeys. I've been very fortunate not to be faced with this type of decision making, but friends of mine who have been through this type of thing, you don't understand where their journey is. And so it is so difficult where there is this huge gap between legislation and rules and emotion. And I think that's one of the tough areas we have in this debate, is that you want to be sympathetic, empathetic, but rules are almost designed not to be, because they are supposed to be the unemotional position of policy. And so these two things rub up against each other so awkwardly.
Also, there's no judgment here. I remember once asking my father, GP for 40 years, what's the worst thing that he treats? And I thought he was going to say something like multiple sclerosis or another sort of physically debilitating condition. And he said, without a doubt, it's severe depression. And I remember him telling me that when I was very, very young, and him talking of patients who, to all intents and purposes, one day were okay and the next in a desperately, desperately difficult situation. But Abigail, we look forward to reading your piece, and thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
Thanks for having me.
Lord Falconer, this has been a very complicated, nuanced debate about assisted dying. Explain the bill that you are introducing.
The bill I'm introducing on Friday allows people who are terminally ill and have 6 months or less to live to be assisted by being given drugs by a medical professional to end their lives, but only in the context of them being terminally ill and only after 2 doctors have said they are terminally ill and are capable of making a decision to take their own life, and a High Court judge has said it's okay. So it's very safeguarded, and it doesn't go to deal with people who are suffering intolerably but have not got a reduction or a significant reduction in life expectancy.
And Lord Falconer, why is this important to you?
It's important to me for personal reasons. Like so many people who got engaged in the debate, I got engaged in the debate because a member of my family was dying. And as the end becomes near, you see people who, and everybody knows it, have only got a few days or a few weeks to live. They may have turned their face to the wall, and the only thing that they've got to look forward to is clawing out those last few days or few weeks or few months. Not everybody will want an assisted death, but it's an option that I think should be available to people so that they can choose the manner of how they die.
You introduced a similar bill a decade ago. Have things changed between what you proposed a decade ago, which was ultimately didn't get through the procedures of both houses? Have things changed since that time?
As far as people's support for the bill, I think things in one sense haven't changed. If one looks at polling over a 20-year period, there's always been figures of about 80% in support of it. As far as Parliament is concerned, although the Lords have been supportive for maybe a decade, the Commons has been generally against it. But I feel that the time has been reached now where the tide is right for this change to come. If you look at other bits of, or outlying bits of the United Kingdom, so the Isle of Man yesterday just passed an assisted dying bill for those who are terminally ill by a significant majority, so that's going to go through. One of the Channel Islands has passed, or is about to pass, such a bill, and Scotland is in the process of going through a bill which is likely to pass. I strongly feel, unlike 10 years ago, that the mood is right for the change to occur. The Prime Minister, when he was Leader of the Opposition, said that if a bill got a second reading in the Commons, then he would make sure that time was made available for that bill to get through all its later stages, because one of the great problems about private members' bills in the Commons and the Lords is they don't have enough time to get through. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has been a supporter for a very long time. So you have, as it were, the stars aligning at this particular point. And I've now had the good fortune to have come high in the Lords private members ballot. So it's rising very, very much to the surface. I don't know if you recall, Kamal, but very recently Esther Rantzen, who I think might be on this podcast as well, in the context of her terminal illness, raised the issue. And watching the way that she raised the issue, she really struck a chord with the public, it seems to me. So I think the time is right for the matter to be debated. I think there needs to be a full debate. Parliamentary procedures are coming together to make it likely that now the Lords, but most importantly the Commons, are going to have to decide, do they support the change?
Could you just run us through what the route to change could be? You're introducing this bill in the Lords.
Yeah.
There's been some suggestion in the reporting that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, would much prefer this to be a bill introduced in the Commons. What's the route for any bill or any legislation to become law?
A bill has got to go through both houses of Parliament. The key thing from the point of view of the Prime Minister, and I completely understand this, is that the Commons have got to indicate their willingness to agree to such a bill in principle. And the way that they would do that would be by giving a second reading to a bill in favour of assisted dying. There is a ballot for private members' bills, which MPs put their name into a ballot, and the person who comes out top and the next sort of 6 or 7 will get an opportunity to pass a bill through the Commons. If somebody who comes near the top of that ballot wants an assisted dying bill, then that would be the perfect opportunity on which the Commons could vote to indicate or not that they favoured the process. It's much better that it's a common starter rather than a Lord's starter, but we both have ballots. I've won in my ballot, so I'm going to proceed with it. But if the Commons takes it up and votes in favour of it, that's where all the action will be, and that's where the action should be.
Let's go through the debate itself. You have pressures in the bill that you've put forward, sort of from both sides. One side that is fundamentally opposed to the whole idea of assisted dying becoming legal in England and Wales, and certainly the United Kingdom. And from the other side, those that say that the bill that you are introducing does not go far enough. And I think there are two areas there. On the people who argue that this bill does not go far enough, as you say, safeguards and only for the terminally ill. Others argue that those who have physical illness, which causes what is described as incurable suffering, assisted dying should also be available to them. What do you say to those campaigners who say you haven't been ambitious and brave enough in the bill that you have put forward?
Well, for me, it's a point of principle that the law should not extend to people who are not terminally ill but have some sort of unbearable suffering. And I think it's for two reasons. I don't think the state should be helping people to take their own life unless they are in a situation of terminal illness anyway. I think it is something that the state should set its face against. But secondly and separately, as a matter of practicality, once you allow in unbearable suffering, that becomes a very subjective matter, which leads to areas where obviously I think people should not be assisted to take their own life. We know from some countries like Belgium, where unbearable suffering is the test, that, for example, people who are quite young, in their 20s or 30s, want to take their own life, maybe because they're suffering from some sort of mental illness or depression. I am very, very strongly against it, that sort of situation. And if one looks around the world, those countries that take unbearable suffering as their test end up with these dilemmas about whether they allow people in their 30s to take their own life, whereas those countries that start with a bill that says it's only for the terminally ill don't extend beyond terminal illness. So the first jurisdiction that did it was Oregon. They started with terminal illness and have never moved from that. Canada had unbearable suffering, and now they've got great debates about where the line should be drawn. As long as one is clear that it's only in the context of a terminal illness, I don't think one will, as it were, go down a slippery slope in the way that these other countries have done. And for the reasons I've given, I'm against it. The other side of the coin is not that it doesn't go far enough, is that it goes too far.
Well, it should not happen.
It should not happen, exactly. They're against it on principle. And people who are against it in principle are saying, well, there's a risk of abuse of this, and abuse can take unsubtle forms, people pressing their relatives to go earlier than they otherwise would, and more subtle forms, namely, I don't want to be a burden to my family. We've got pretty strong safeguards, which I've already mentioned, 2 doctors and a High Court judge. I think this option should be available to people. And if one looks at other countries where this option has been available, there is no evidence that it is used in an abusive way. Far from it. In very many places where it is available, the fact that it is available makes people feel much more comfortable about their last months or their last weeks or their last days, because they know the option is there and they feel more able to deal with what is happening. In Oregon, for example, which I've already mentioned, people take out a prescription from which they will die once it is administered, but very often the prescription is never used for the reasons that I've given. I think it is very, very lacking in compassion to say we can't have this option because it might be abused. It almost certainly won't be abused, and it certainly will not be something which puts at risk disabled people. One of the most interesting things is there are a number of campaigners who are worried about the plight of the disabled. All the polling that has been done over the last 20 years reveals that the disabled are just as supportive of this measure as other groups in society.
Just on that issue around disabled people, could I just put to you Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson, who is speaking on this podcast? She has said, I think there are two areas there where just to build a little on what you've said. Firstly, that if there was proper access to excellent palliative care, end-of-life care, that there would be no need for this move towards assisted dying. And the second thing is, and I think it's this idea of, in a perfect situation, Lord Falconer, yes, when you have no tensions between maybe family members, that the person who is considering assisted death is not just doing it because they may feel under pressure or they may feel lonely. Let me put to you what Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson has said. I'm really worried that disabled people, because of the cost of health and social care, because that's being removed, this was under the previous government, that choice on palliative care is then taken away. So the only choice they have is to end their lives.
On the palliative care thing, I'm as strongly in favour as I could be of the best palliative care being available everywhere. It plainly isn't at the moment, but there is no either or here. You should be, and I am promoting as much as possible, good palliative care. And again, the experience from other countries where this option, that's the option of an assisted death, becomes available, that inevitably promotes a debate about how people die, and that in its wake promotes a debate about the quality of palliative care. Yeah. In many countries where it's been introduced, palliative care has gone up. So I don't think it's an either or. In relation to Tanni's second point, namely, because palliative care is not available, all I've got is the option of an assisted death. Well, the safeguards will ensure that that will not happen. And indeed, remember that the safeguards will make this decision a much more safeguarded decision than the much more likely decision that people with health problems have got to take, which is, do I continue with treatment? Because there's nothing to stop people stopping treatment now. We don't hear very often of people being over-forced into decisions about not taking treatment, because mostly people's relatives are not of the sort that people are trying to guard against with the safeguards. But be that as it may, the decision about whether or not to have an assisted death in the context of terminal illness will be a decision that is more safeguarded than any other decision that one's got to take in the context of healthcare.
We spoke to Wes Streeting, who's now obviously the Health Secretary, but we spoke to him before the election. He got into many of the debates that we're having here. But one thing he did say was his faith also presented difficulties for his journey around the discussion around assisted dying. Just wondered, Lord Falconer, do you have a faith?
I'm an atheist.
Does that make it an easier decision for people who don't have a religious faith to have these types of debates? Because for people of faith, the idea that there should be human intervention in some manner to assist people in dying goes against the fundamental principles of their faith. And you know that in the debate here, those of maybe Catholic faith or from Islam will say, this is not a thing that governments or legislation should be dabbling in. This is not a matter for law.
Well, I completely respect the fact that there are some faiths who would regard this as a sin, just like there are some faiths that would regard homosexuality as a sin, abortion as a sin, divorce as a sin. I strongly take the view that the fact that certain faiths take the view that those sorts of things are sins does not prevent the legislature or the policymakers from moving into an area which they might, in their religious hats, regard as being a sin. Of course, their faith must be respected, and if for that reason it would be something that they would not regard as open to them, and that would include doctors who have a particular faith that would make it anathema to them, there would need to be, as there is in my bill, a conscience clause not to force doctors to be involved if they don't want to be involved in it. But I do not take the view that religion is a bar to introducing a law which is entirely permissive. It is not remotely compulsory, obviously.
Then just finally, Lord Falconer, the language around this, which campaigners against this legislative move point out, that we have moved on from the language of suicide to this idea of assisted dying. Can I just read out to you what Care Not Killing, one of the campaigning groups against any changes in assisted dying legislation or the introduction of assisted dying legislation, have said. So they say worrying data from the US and Europe that shows legalizing euthanasia and assisted suicide, far from reducing the number of suicides, seems to be associated with an increase in the numbers taking their own lives in the general population, perhaps because it normalizes the idea and practice of suicide.
Well, I don't think that the assisted dying law does lead to an increase, and the figures that Care Not Killing produce no causative link in relation to that. So those figures should be dismissed as entirely unreliable. You mentioned the language, and I think you have in mind two things. One, you refer to euthanasia. This is not euthanasia. What we are talking about is people having autonomy to determine how they themselves end their lives. And secondly, I've spoken to a lot of people about this. Assisted dying reflects what the law is going to do. It is in the context of an individual's terminal illness. This is how he or she chooses to end their life. It is not suicide, which carries with it the connotation of bringing a life to an end prematurely. And that is not what my bill is about.
Why is this so important to you?
Because anybody who has experienced a loved one dying, where this option would have so much eased their suffering and was so much what they wanted, would feel that we as a society are not acting with appropriate compassion, and that this is the view of society. It's perhaps best reflected in the UK that we don't have the stomach anymore as a society to go on enforcing the law. So the law is, no matter what your motives, if you assist your loved one to die and you do it in a way that is purely motivated by compassion and love, you are guilty of a crime which has a maximum written sentence of 14 years, and there is no defence of I did it for good reason or I did it motivated by compassion. The law is busted completely, and a long time ago, many years ago, the Director of Public Prosecutions, a Director of Public Prosecutions before Keir Starmer, said in effect, I'll not prosecute in certain cases because it's just too cruel. Let's get rid of a situation where people, for example, go to Switzerland and die in an anonymous flat in Zurich, obviously earlier than in many cases they would like to die, because you've got to have the physical and emotional wherewithal to travel from the UK to Zurich to do it, not in your own home, not surrounded by all of your loved ones. That's one thing that happens. That's an option only open to people who can afford between £10,000 and £15,000, or other people who are incredibly worried about involving other people. The Daily Telegraph some time ago ran a story about Stuart Broad's father's wife, who had an illness. She stored pills and then took them and informed her husband that she'd done it by email so that he wouldn't be involved. And it's these cruelties don't need to be the case. We need to resolve the cruelties.
Given its importance, shouldn't the government take on the legislation and simply introduce a bill themselves to give it a much better chance of getting through both houses?
The Keir has said, and I think every government has said it previously, this is a matter of conscience, so there'd always be a free vote in the Commons and the Lords in relation to it, because it is a conscience matter rather than a matter of government policy, though previous governments have often opposed it. I think Keir is right that this is a matter of conscience. I think he is right that the way to deal with it is by a private member's bill. But once the principle is established, it should not fail simply because of a problem about timing in Parliament.
Lord Falconer, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tanni, welcome to the Daily Tea. We've spoken to a number of people, Esther Rantzen, Charlie Faulkner, who have both been pro-assisted dying. Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, is a bit divided on the issue. I know you come at it from a completely different angle. Why is that, and what do you think?
So for me, I come at it from the point of view of being a disabled woman and the discrimination that I currently face in society. So I'm treated three ways. One is an ex-athlete, generally really nice, parliamentarian, bit mixed, but actually a disabled woman is where I experience all my discrimination. So, I'm regularly told, people like me shouldn't be allowed to be on the tube, we shouldn't have jobs. I've been told numerous times I shouldn't be allowed to have children. And that view of disability, I really worry about how disabled people would be encouraged to think that this would be for them. And when there's very strong voices arguing for choice, and I do get it, I do not want anybody to die in pain. But actually, when people's demand for choice takes choice away from others, that's where it gets, very complicated. And the reality is, palliative care is a postcode lottery. We don't have the right support for end of life. The NHS is in, a really difficult situation. And I absolutely believe that disabled people will be, who feel they have no value in society, will ultimately be encouraged to think about this as an option.
Take us through this choice argument. So speaking to Lord Falconer, I interviewed him yesterday, and he said he has absolute respect for your position, but for people who don't agree with your position, he felt they should be given the choice. Can you just respond in detail to that point, that this is about the choice being offered to people, not that everyone should obviously go through a process like this?
Yeah, so choice is a really difficult one because, should people have ultimate control of their lives? And that's not particularly easy to legislate for. I mean, but actually, that's what we have to do on a daily basis. But choice is a matter of privilege. And there's a lot of people through, cost of living, crisis, the way a lot of disabled people feel in society. And there are disabled people who believe that, assisted suicide should, become law. There's so many people who don't have that platform. And that's where it gets incredibly difficult. So the Mental Capacity Act hasn't been fully enforced. So, the people who wanted to change the law, it's really easy sound bites. It's 2 doctors, settled wish, 6-month diagnosis. The complication is always when you start unpacking that. So, will the system actually spend the time and the effort and the money to understand whether it's a truly settled wish? Now, a colleague of mine said, where there's a will, there's a relative. When you start talking, to maybe your grandmother about, well, think about the house, think about the cost of social care, think, maybe this is what you should think about. That coercion, and we know in anyone who worked on domestic abuse legislation, coercion is absolutely there. And you can't say it's only going to be there for domestic abuse, but it's not going to be there for this. So the level of coercion is really difficult to monitor, and doctors aren't trained to do that. So, I'd much prefer that we look at palliative care, the right support for people. Fundamentally, this will change our relationship with doctors, with the health service, with hospice care. And the bit that we don't talk about death actually for a start, but the bit that is very difficult to talk about is what will the drugs be used. There's an assumption that it's a little needle, you get the injection, it's a Hollywood death, you slip away with your friends and your loved one around you. And there's data from all the jurisdictions around the world that show that it's not, always the case that this happens. People have woken up. They've if you take it as a drink, it is absolutely revolting. The number of pills you'd have to take are quite significant, and the drugs aren't tested on anybody. So one of the versions that we've seen is where the first injection paralyzes you, so we don't know how people die. We don't know whether there's pain or suffering. You just don't see it. So when we get to debating this legislation, and we've talked about it a lot over the years, and that's the sort of detail that we need to be looking at and discussing to make sure that there's protection. So for me, I don't commit from a religious point of view. I just think there's not enough detail, and the safeguards are not there. Every single jurisdiction around the world that's brought in this legislation, either through court or through change or just practice, it's widened, and that worries me as well. For the people who say this will be it, that hasn't happened in any of the jurisdiction around the world.
Tanni, just to pick up on one thing you said at the beginning, which frankly is disturbing to hear, I've got to be honest, how you are made to feel as a disabled woman. And we can look at you and say you're a high-profile disabled woman, and that's how you're being made to feel. So people who haven't got your profile, one imagines, are made to feel even worse. So that point about disabled people feeling they may be a burden, can you just explain that a bit more for the people listening and watching this?
I mean, the day-to-day reality for disabled people is that life is incredibly difficult. So, education, I still deal with hundreds of issues a year for disabled people who can't get access to mainstream education, can't get access to health and social care, can't get employment, can't get housing. 50% of the disabled people who are able to work have a job because of discrimination. I can't get on a train without the permission or support of a non-disabled person, apart from in Liverpool where there's a closed loop and a couple of other places. Trains were meant to be step-free in this country by January the 1st, 2020. The last government's own figures it was going to be 100 years before I could get on a train on my own. So it's the low-level discrimination that happens every day. And, the challenges for disabled people is there are a number of conditions that would very easily fit into that 6-month diagnosis.
Just finally, Tanni, could I ask you, is it a moral issue around end of life and there being access to assisted death?
And that's a really interesting question in terms of the morality of whether we end someone's life or not. I think for me it's slightly wider than that in terms of how it changes our relationship with society and doctors. And, for me, I watched both my parents die, not necessarily in great circumstances. And I think as much as the people who support this legislation, obviously that lived experience has made them go one way to support the change in law. For me, it sent me the other way very strongly in terms of how we can help, support, protect people, give them the right palliative care, and help them live their lives as best they can, rather than saying, okay, you're done now and ending someone's life, which is so final. There is no coming back from that. And I think once the law changes, everything in society changes.
Tanni Grey-Thompson, thank you so much for your views and for expressing them so candidly on the Daily Tea today.